We're going to start with broadband. I'm going to turn it over to the team here to kind of get into some of the hot broadband grants available to counties. I do want to mention that these aren't all of the programs available to counties for broadband related purposes. We're just highlighting some of the larger ones and some of the newer ones. So we'll have resources for you that provide information on all grant programs available to counties on these opportunities. So today we're just going to feature a few of them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the team.
Thank you much, Christy. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon, and we look forward to providing some good information for you on different grants available. But we'll start off first, as Christy mentioned, with broadband and specifically the Rural E-Connectivity Loan and Grant Program, or Reconnect. So this program offers federal loans, grants, and loan grant combinations to help get broadband to rural areas that lack sufficient broadband access, and that's defined as 100 megabits per second downstream and 20 megabits upstream. Proposed facilities funded by Reconnect must be capable of delivering 100 megabits symmetrical service to every premise in the proposed funded service area at the same time. And any technology that can deliver 100 megabits symmetrical service at the same time to every premise is eligible for funding. So that's everything from fiber to fixed wireless. It just has to meet that 100 megabit symmetrical service requirement. Eligible applicants can either be a nonprofit or a for-profit organization and must take one of the following forms: a corporation, limited liability companies, or limited liability partnerships, of course, cooperatives or mutual organizations. Importantly for CSAC, states, local governments, or any agency, subdivision, or political subdivision thereof, a territory, or an Indian tribe. Individuals and legal general partnerships are not eligible entities. In addition, co-applicants are not eligible, and if two entities want to partner in delivering broadband to areas without sufficient access, one entity must take the lead on submitting an application. However, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, limited liability partnerships are considered eligible entities, and they must have at least two partners in the relationship. So getting to the areas that are eligible, only areas where at least 50% of households lack access to 120 megabit service are eligible for Reconnect funding. So if fewer than 50% of the households in an area lack access to 120 megabit service, the area is not eligible to be served. USDA Rural Development uses several methods to verify whether a particular PFSA currently has 100 megabits downstream and 120 megabits upstream broadband service. It will post a public notice filing of the proposed service area on their Reconnect webpage. And service providers in those areas can submit a public notice response indicating whether they already provide that service. Then USDA will conduct a service area validation within the areas of the PFSA where that public notice response is filed. Since the intent of the Reconnect program is to bring high-speed broadband service to rural residences and businesses, standalone middle mile projects are not eligible. However, middle mile facilities are eligible if they are necessary to bring sufficient broadband service to all premises in the PFSA. As I mentioned earlier, there are 5 types of funding available within this FOA, and this graph basically shows an overview of the different requirements and other obligations for each of these programs. The 100% loan in round 4, which was the last funding cycle, a total of up to $150 million was available for loans. The maximum amount that could be requested in an application was $50 million. For the 50% loan, 50% grant combination, up to $150 million was available in round 4. The maximum amount that could be requested in an application was $25 million for the loan and $25 million for the grant. The loan and grant amounts will always be equal, and that'll probably be the same case for round 5. For the 100% grant, up to $150 million was available in round 4. The maximum amount of grant funds that could be requested in an application was $25 million. The maximum amount an applicant may request increases to $35 million if the applicant demonstrates that the PFSA is comprised 100% of areas classified by the USDA Economic Research Service as frontier and remote level 4 areas. And an area meets that level 4 designation if it is a rural area located 15 minutes or more from an urban area of 2,500 to approximately 10,000 people, and 30 minutes or more from an urban area of 10,000 to almost 25,000 people, and so on and so forth. There's several categories for that. And for the 100% grant program for tribal governments, colonias, basically persistent poverty areas or socially vulnerable communities, up to $350 million was available for grants in round 4, and the maximum amount of grants funded that could be requested in an application was $25 million. So if an applicant demonstrates that the PFSA is comprised 100% of locations with areas classified by the FAR level 4, the applicant can request up to $35 million. And then finally, projects proposing to serve areas where 90% of the households lack sufficient access to broadband, up to $200 million was available for grants in round 4, and the maximum amount of grant funds that could be requested in an application was $25 million. The requirement for at least 50% of the households to lack access to sufficient broadband service to be eligible does not apply to this category. Instead, for this funding source, not more than 10% of homes in the PFSA can have sufficient access to broadband. Other information to know, currently a match is not required for applications submitted under the 100% grant for tribal areas, or for projects where 90% of households lack sufficient access to broadband. So that's good news for those areas. And the interest rate for the 100% loans is fixed at 2%, while the interest rate for the loan portion of the loan grant combinations is set at the U.S. Treasury rate for the remaining period of time in advance of each of the funds. In the Community Connect program, this grant program offers financial assistance to eligible applicants that will construct broadband networks that provide service at or above broadband speed to all premises in rural, economically challenged communities where broadband service does not exist. Generally, projects will provide community-oriented connectivity to stimulate economic development and provide enhanced educational and healthcare opportunities in rural areas. Priority will be given to rural areas that demonstrate the greatest need for broadband service. The broadband projects must deliver a speed of 100 megabits downstream and 120 megabits upstream for fixed terrestrial broadband service, whether that's fixed, such as fiber, or wireless, like a fixed wireless service. Eligible areas are those that lack broadband speed of at least 25 down and 3 megabits up. The PFSA must be a contiguous geographic area located entirely within an eligible rural area in which the 25 down and 3 up broadband service does not exist, and where the applicant proposes to offer 120 megabit services to all residential and business customers. And the PFSA may consist of multiple municipalities and may be located in more than one state. Eligible applicants include state and local governments, federally recognized tribes, cooperatives, nonprofits, for-profit corporations, and limited liability companies. An eligible project costs include the construction, acquisition, or leasing of facilities, spectrum, land, or buildings used to deploy broadband service. And the cost of providing the 100 down 20 megabit up broadband service must be free of charge to all participating essential community facilities within that proposed funded service area for at least 2 years. And the essential community facility is defined as a public improvement operated on a nonprofit basis, needed for the orderly development of a rural community, where the rural community is a city, town, or an equivalent county or multi-county area. And some of the examples of essential community facilities include like healthcare facilities and services, including hospitals, fire, rescue, and public safety facilities or services, community, public, social, educational, or cultural facilities or services, and community parks, community activity centers, and similar types of facilities. It also includes the cost of providing a community center within the PFSA with a minimum of 2 and up to 10 computer access points and wireless access at the 100 down 20 megabit up broadband service speed to all users for at least 2 years free of charge. And less than 10% of the grant amount, or up to $150,000, may be used for the improvement, expansion, construction, or acquisition of a community center that provides online access to the public. Importantly, Community Connect funds may not be used to duplicate costs, services, connections, facilities, or equipment that have been authorized under such areas. And for the next opportunity, we have the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program. This program is funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. They are planning and implementation programs that provide funding to promote digital inclusion and advanced equity for all. The programs aim to ensure that all communities can access and use affordable, reliable, high-speed internet to meet their needs and improve their lives. There are 3 Digital Equity Act programs: the State Planning Grant Program, which is a $60 million formula grant program for states, territories, and tribal governments to develop state digital equity plans. There's the State Capacity Grant Program, which is a $1.44 billion formula grant program for states, territories, and tribal governments that will fund an annual grant program for 5 years in support of digital equity projects and the implementation of digital equity plans. My colleague Heidi will have more information on that program. And finally, the Competitive Grant Program, which is a $1.25 billion program that will fund an annual competitive grant for 5 years to implement digital equity projects. Private sector, public sector, and non-for-profit entities can apply for these funds. There is a timing sequence for these 3 programs under the Act. States interested in participating in the Capacity Grant Program must first apply for the state planning grants. Upon receipt of those planning funds, states have 1 year to complete their digital equity plans. The digital equity plan is a critical predicate for achievement of digital equity goals, as the drafting of that plan provides states the opportunity to cast a vision for and really think critically about how they will support the achievement of digital equity in their states. Many states have already drafted their plans and are either seeking public comment right now or have finished incorporating public comments and have finalized their plans. And once completed, states will be eligible to apply for funds to implement the plans through the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program. And the law does require NTIA to establish the competitive grant program not later than 30 days after the NTIA begins awarding state digital equity capacity grants. There are several examples of eligible uses of these funds across all 3 programs: developing, implementing, and overseeing digital equity plans, making awards to other entities to help in developing digital equity plans, improving the online accessibility and inclusivity of public resources, implementing digital equity plans and digital inclusion activities, providing digital literacy and skills education to covered populations, and facilitating the adoption of high-speed internet by covered populations. So that's a quick overview of some of the key broadband programs that we should be looking at. There is a map. If you go to the USDA RUS Reconnect, they do have a map available that you can but basically pull up your proposed funded service area and look to see whether or not there is broadband already provided in that area. And that's based off of state broadband maps, and of course also the FCC's national broadband map, which was recently updated. So there is that capability to go in and see whether or not the broadband exists in your PFSA.
David did a really great overview of some of the grants that are coming up for broadband, but as David intimated during his discussion, it sounds like some of the federal funding that's out there is predominantly going towards state programs to states. So states are directly getting most of the funding. So how do counties really access that, and what programs are out there that counties can actually apply to through the state to access some of these federal funds trickling down? So the first program I'm going to talk about is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, BEAD program. And so I'm going to just refer to it from BEAD from now on. This program was funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as a $42.45 billion federal grant program that aims to get all Americans online by funding partnerships between states or territories, communities, and stakeholders to build infrastructure to where it is needed and to increase adoption of high-speed internet. This program really lays the critical groundwork for widespread access, affordability, equity, and adoption of broadband. It also is geared towards creating good paying jobs, growing economic opportunities, including for local workers, and providing increased access to healthcare services, enrich educational experiences for students, and close long-standing equity gaps and improve the overall quality of life for Americans. The BEAD program, that when it's released on the federal level, only allows states to apply for the opportunity. However, the BIL stated in its program regulations that there needs to be an opportunity for community members and local governments like counties to access some of those funds. So in California, BEAD is being implemented by the California Public Utilities Commission, CPUC. California has been allocated approximately $1.86 billion under the BEAD program, based on the federal government's calculations of California's share of unserved locations nationally. The program's principal focus is on deploying broadband services to unserved locations, which is defined as those without any broadband service at all, or with broadband services offering speeds below 25 megabits per second downstream and 3 megabits per second upstream. They are also prioritizing underserved locations defined as those without broadband service offerings at speeds of 100 megabits per second downstream and 20 megabits per second upstream. So as I mentioned, as part of the program, CPUC is required to gather public input in an open public proceeding to determine specifically how BEAD funds will be offered to qualified subgrantees, which could be counties. The federal rules for BEAD give the overall rules for the program, while CPUC currently is setting up the schedule for the competitive process of selecting subgrantees, and specific requirements for those subgrantees must follow to build a robust, high-quality broadband network. These new networks will be built in federally defined eligible areas that are underserved and unserved communities across the state. BEAD-funded subgrantees may also build to community anchor institutions like schools or libraries, provided they are also currently meeting the unserved eligibility standards that I previously outlined. So when you're scoping your projects, you want to be focused on the unserved first and then the underserved. With the BEAD federal rules, the CPUC will have to establish subgrantee rules as mandated by the BEAD program itself for the required elements like workforce development and federal fair wages for those building the infrastructure. But the state, so CPUC, gets to define affordability standards for the completed new broadband system, as well as audit and risk assessment standards to protect against waste, fraud, and abuse as the networks are deployed. And so that is what the state is currently working on. The federal rules require the CPUC to submit a high-level 5-year action plan to NTIA, establishing California's broadband goals and priorities and serving as a comprehensive needs assessment that will inform California's forthcoming initial proposal, which is due to NTIA by the end of 2023. So the 5-year, high-level 5-year plan is currently had an open public comment period in California that closed a little bit earlier in August. And then they will be submitting a final one to NTIA. And in the meantime, the CPUC is working on developing the initial proposal, which will be due to NTIA at the end of the year. So the initial proposal, which again is due at the end of the year, establishes the rules for the BEAD program, which will include the requirements for the challenge process, how CPUC is going to select subgrantees, and other implementation details for the program. So counties will want to be monitoring the CPUC website to see their draft initial proposal, because there will be a comment period for it, for you to input on how you think the program is going to be developed. California is expected to release the initial proposal this fall and counties should expect the subgrantee competition to occur in 2024 for the first time. So what can be used? What are the eligible uses for funds under this grant program? This program will serve projects like planning for the deployment of high-speed internet, including conducting research, collecting data, outreach, and training. Funds can also be used for deploying and upgrading internet in unserved and underserved areas, or improving service to community anchor organizations. It can be used for installing internet and Wi-Fi in multi-unit residential buildings, adoption of digital equity programs. And one thing that David mentioned earlier is, in the 5-year plan that is being published for the BEAD program, it also is going to include some of the digital equity planning elements that is required for a previous program spoken about. And then finally, funds can also be used for workforce development programs and vocational training, as broadband needs are, training needs are needed nationally. So the next grant program that I'm going to speak to that is flowing directly to the state, but counties will have an opportunity to access some of the funds, is the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program, which is a $1.4 billion formula grant to states, territories, Indian tribes, Alaska Native entities, and Native Hawaiian organizations. This program is going to be funded annually between fiscal years 2022 and 2026 in support of implementing digital equity plans, which the state is currently working on. California did receive or submit a grant to the Digital Equity Plans program offered through NTIA and is currently working on it. There has been a lot of opportunity for public input on the development of that plan. And the reason this is so important is that states interested in competing in this capacity grant program must first apply to the digital equity planning grants and complete its state digital equity plans. As David briefly overviewed, the state digital equity plans is very critical to achieve digital equity goals nationally, and drafting the plan will provide the state with the opportunity to cast its vision and critically think about how it will support the achievement of digital equity across California. The planning process is meant to bring in a diverse set of stakeholders to the table, assess data, and more to ensure that the capacity funding is used most effectively to close the digital divide in California. Again, California has submitted its application for the planning grant, which is currently under consideration. So once that planning grant is approved and they submit, they get their plan approved by NTIA, the State Digital Equity Capacity Program will have to begin no later than 2 years after NTIA begins awarding the state digital equity planning grants. And upon receipt of the planning funds, states will have 1 year to complete their digital equity plan. And then once they complete their equity plan, they will be eligible to apply for funds to implement their capacity grants. And that's where counties will have the opportunity to submit their projects for digital equity consideration in the state's program. And so we're anticipating the solicitation for this to come out in 2024.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I've magically transformed my location and broadband to upgrade my access. I wanted to ask, if you're a CSAC member, your county going through these federally sponsored programs, how do you even find the grants, and where should we be looking for these funds? It seems like it's coming out of multiple directions.
That is very true. So the aside from using the CSAC office hours, I would definitely point counties to be looking at NTIA's really interactive broadband federal funding guide. The NTIA releases this guide on an annual basis to enhance Broadband USA's one-stop federal funding site. The guide provides interactive step-by-step approaches for users to filter through more than 70 funding opportunities for various federal agencies that would support broadband. What is important to note about this guide is that broadband might not be the prime focus or intent for those programs that are listed in it. So while these programs that you'll find in the guide could support some broadband type of project, it likely for some of them, for example, for those coming out of HUD, would need to have some type of housing driver behind it. So it's very important when you go through the guide that you understand that while broadband is an eligible activity within some of these programs, they are not the focal point or the focus of it. The great thing about this guide, though, is it gives you a very quick way to whittle down some of the programs, and it highlights general information about each program. It includes program descriptions, important dates, contact information, and links to program websites. These guides were developed in response to feedback from users from federal funding sites, and the interactive guide can be used both offline and online across multiple programs. So this is a really great spot to kind of go through. What you see on this in that table is just a snapshot of some of the programs which local governments are eligible to apply for, and what those programs focus is, or what you could submit a broadband project for under those programs.
Thanks so much for that. And then can I ask to go further, how should a county, a CSAC member, be thinking about getting ready to compete for these funds?
So I would love to talk about this subject, because this is something that we talk about with all of our grants and all the people that we work with, actually, is try and get yourself ready to apply for a grant before that solicitation comes out. We always say, I don't remember the percentage, Christy can tell us, like 80% of having a successful grant is being ready before the solicitation drops, and then 20% is writing. I think those are the percentages. Anyway, so the first thing that you really need to do is start pulling your data. And that includes doing a complete service assessment. So here you want to identify the areas that need to be improved and any assets that can be leveraged in the process. You're also going to want to identify those areas that Heidi spoke about that are unserved, that have the speeds below 25 megabits per second for downstream and 3 for upstream, and also take it a step further for underserved for those speeds below 100 and for downstream and 20 for upstream. You'll also want to document your demand for broadband services. Here, you really want to get a good understanding of how individuals and businesses are actually utilizing broadband. And one of the best ways that you could do that is just to do a survey of the different households and businesses and see what they're using, how they're using it, how often they're using it, get a good feel. You're going to want to map your community infrastructure assets. So using a geomapping tool, you want to locate all the things that are going to be used in the project. So you want to locate your conduits, ducts, etc., all of the actual things, as well as the institutions, businesses, and residents that are interested in improving their broadband. You'll also want to map out any electric co-ops infrastructure assets, including meters, cabinets, fiber, rights of way, etc., all of those things. And finally, we suggest talking with other service providers, ISPs, utilities, co-ops. Ask about what future plans they may have and what can be done to encourage deployment, perhaps work together. And then on going further, we also want you to work on identifying your community champions and supporters. So community involvement and participation is really big in all of the federal grant space right now, even in the very, very technical grants. So you're going to want to reach out to local community groups who will provide support for your project. One of the big topics that we're seeing across all of the grant space is making sure that disadvantaged communities are actually receiving the benefits from federally funded projects. So you want to identify and partner with community groups who will ensure that these communities are being represented and actually receiving benefits. And also, you're going to want to explore working with project partners. In addition to the community groups, you want to build relationships with these partners, entities who will provide financial support, perhaps offer incentives for services, maybe serve on a community advisory board, provide general outreach, really be a big part of your program. You can also work to take steps to ease potential service providers access to utility poles and rights of way. So we want to make sure that everybody works together and everything goes smoothly when the time comes. So for pole attachments, you want to make sure that your project partners have access to the poles. Make ready, hang fiber in the power space versus the communication space. And during installation, establish your responsibilities and procedures for fiber installation down to the discussion of labor costs. Back to collecting more data, conduct your engineering study, get going on this. This is a very important step. If you can start the process, work with your partner and a provider to identify the best locations to actually deploy the broadband. And finally, start exploring some financial incentives. Do your research, look into all those options that Heidi talked about, or contact us through our office hours. We want to look to see what sort of opportunities are available in the bipartisan infrastructure law to help see what may be applicable to your specific project.
So we had a question asking about the eligibility for the digital equity competitive grants, if they were local governments or is that at the state level? David Hoover answered that question in the Q&A box, but the answer is that private sector, public sector, and not-for-profit entities can apply for those grants or those funds. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody got that information on the question that was answered. So thank you, Jasmine, for the question. We got another question too about the sharing of information on the grants, and I mentioned it earlier, but we will be following up with all attendees and participants with information on each of these grant programs as follow-up to the webinar. So that is coming as well.
Are there any grants that can't be layered on top of or in addition to other grants? Good question.
There are rules with every grant program as to how much federal funding can be go towards one project. And so each of the grant guidelines will stipulate how much, or if there is a cap or is not a cap, on whether or not your singular project can receive funds from various sources. Typically, these programs have like up to a 90% or 80% federal funding that can go to one single project. And you just have to be mindful of the required matches for each of the programs and how all the funding pots interact. I know that the state of California has released several grant programs and will be releasing more grant programs over through the end of 2023 and into 2024. And the Last Mile FFA program is currently out there right now. Those programs can likely be layered into some of these other grants that exist that we talked about earlier, because most of that funding is actually just state funding. So it really depends on the source of where those grants are coming from and what the federal regulations say.